Wherever it is that you need breakthrough in your life, what we've been discovering over these many weeks together in this collection of sermons is that breakthrough comes by faithfulness, not force. I'm talking about any area of your life, whether it's in your friendships or your finances. Come on, whether it's in the future you have, your relationship, breakthrough comes not by force, but by faithfulness. And so throughout this time together, and including on today, we've been centering our thinking and centering our conversation around this title of the series that really is the key. It really is the solution. It's the antidote. It's what you need in your life. That is to keep showing up. Because if you'll bring the faithfulness, God will do what only God can do in any and every area of your life. But you must keep showing up. Today, I want to walk up into an aspect of our lives that, quite honestly, we all, whether you're a person of faith or not, we all, as human beings, I believe on some level look to God for, or we want God to come through on some level at some moment in our life. Today I want to encourage you to keep showing up and experience breakthrough concerning provision. Provision. I mean, let me just ask you a question. Wherever you are, however you may be on today, whether you're watching this with others at church online, you're leaning in on YouTube, maybe you're listening to this podcast, have you ever asked God for something? Now, I'm not even saying that makes you a Christian, because it doesn't, but have you ever asked God for something? Maybe you prayed for healing in your own body, saying you were sick, you were hurting, you were in pain, there was a massive need. You said, God, help me. Have you ever asked God for something? Maybe it was for somebody you loved, and you prayed for their healing. Somebody you knew, somebody in your family, a friend, a coworker, and you asked God to do what only God can do. You asked God for something. Maybe you asked God for wisdom. God, I don't know what to do in this situation. Would you help me? Maybe you ask God for direction. I don't know what opportunity I'm supposed to take. I don't know if I'm maybe supposed to reject all the opportunities around me and stay put. You've asked God for something. You said, like DMX did one time, Lord, give me a sign. Like maybe you asked for, I need to see and I need to know. You've asked God for something. Have you ever asked God for anything? Maybe you asked him for money. God, I'm broke. Like 10 Commandments broke. Help me. God, I need a place to stay. God, I need a different car. I need a car that I don't have to pray for every morning that it would start. God, I need some transportation in my life. Have you ever asked God for something? I bet you have. Whether this is something you do regularly or something you do from time to time, I bet there's a good chance that at some point in your life, you've asked God to do something for you. To do that is to do what the great leader in our faith, E.M. Bounds, once said, is to project faith on God. Whenever you, maybe in prayer, ask God, maybe through a quiet moment or a loud shout, you ask God. What you literally do in that moment is you project faith on him. You say, God, I believe you can do this, so I'm going to ask you to do for me, through me, with me, in me, what only you can do. Whenever you do that, this is a good thing. I believe this is a needed thing. But this is not what I'm talking about today. That this is not what I came to share with you. I didn't come to share with you some secret code that if you'll say it like this and do it like this, then God will do whatever it is you want him to do. Because quite honestly, that code don't exist. And there isn't some magical formula or magical place. And if you do this and say this at this time, then God will do whatever you want to do. I'm not trying to give you the code. What I'm trying to do today is to change your focus. Today, I want to pivot your direction when it comes to this thing called provision. I want to change the object that gets your attention when it comes to this thing called provision. Because you see, it is one thing to ask God for provision, but it's a totally different thing to trust him as provider. It is one thing to come to God and say, God, I need you to show up. God, I need you to work. I need you to heal. I need you to bless. I need you to provide. It is one thing to ask God for provision. It is an entirely different set of realities to trust him as provider. And please understand this before we dive into even our text on today. It doesn't matter what God does for you. Until you learn to trust him as provider, you will never be satisfied with the provision. It does not matter what God does for you. It doesn't matter how he heals, doesn't matter how he shows up, doesn't matter how he blesses, doesn't matter what he brings your way, who he brings your way, when he brings it your way. It doesn't matter the success he puts around you and entrusts you. It does not matter. You will never be satisfied with the provision until you learn to trust him as provider. Because there's always more. There's always something else. There's always another mountain to climb. There's always another need that pops up. There's always another blessing you want to come your way. And the reason I know this is not just personal experience. It's because this has always been how it goes. God gets involved in people's lives. He blesses, he provides, he heals, he saves, he delivers. And you would think that would be enough for people to trust him as provider. And it's not. Because it requires something different. I want to turn your attention today to the book of Exodus. And we're going to read a few verses together about a moment in the life of the nation, the children of Israel, as they have come out of captivity in Egypt. But yet we're going to ping pong around as I bring to light much of what went on in a quick sense around that time, before and after. But I want to hone in on this moment, because once you see this moment, maybe it won't jump out at you quite like it will in a few moments. But I want you to see a God who loves and cares and provided over and over and over again, contrasted with people who received that provision, and it still wasn't enough. Because it wasn't about provision, and it wasn't about providing. It was always about learning to trust God as provider. Let's read a few verses together. The book of Exodus chapter 16 is where we're going to camp for a few moments today. We're going to start in verse 11. Here's the way the scripture reads. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses. Moses is the man of God at this time. He is the leader. He's the mouthpiece of God to God's people. God said, I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will eat bread until you are full. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. So at evening, quail came and covered the camp. In the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When that layer of dew evaporated, there were fine flakes on the desert surface, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they asked one another, what is that? Because they didn't know what it was. Moses told them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord commanded. Gather as much of it as each person needs to eat. You may take 2 quarts per individual, according to the number of people each of you has in his tent. So the Israelites did this. Some gathered a lot, some a little. When they measured it by quarts, the person who gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat. Moses said to them, "No one is to let any of it remain until morning." But they didn't listen to Moses. Some people kept part of it until morning, and it bred worms and it stank. Therefore Moses was angry with them. They gathered it every morning. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat. But when the sun grew hot and melted on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much food, 4 quarts apiece. All the leaders of the community came and reported to Moses. He told them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Set aside everything left over to be kept until the morning." So they set it aside until morning as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or have maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you won't find any in the field. For 6 days you will gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none." You would think, even if you're just a logical person, right? You would think that with all God had done for them, that trusting God would be easy by now. But it wasn't. I mean, these are the very same people. For those of you that may need and want, I can catch you up on sort of where we are in the story of Scripture. These are the very same people that have literally firsthand lived and experienced some of the most dramatic deliverances that God would ever do for people, through people, by his own hand. These people were living as slaves in Egypt when God brought plagues into Egypt to get the attention of the Pharaoh. I'm talking about they were the ones that saw the Nile River turn to blood. They were the ones that saw entire spans of time with darkness so dark that you could not see your hand in front of your face. That they saw the locusts and they saw cattle dying, and they literally were there and trusted the word of God to paint blood on the doorpost of their house when the angel of death passed through the land. They lived through this. They saw a Pharaoh whose heart was so hard and anger so great towards Israel that he would never let them go. Finally get fed up and tell them to leave. And they left their slavery. They left their captivity in Egypt, only to find themselves a little while down the road with the Red Sea in front of them, mountains on both sides, and Pharaoh changing his mind and coming behind them to attack them. And God parts the waters of the Red Sea, and the entirety of the people of Israel pass through the Red Sea on dry ground. They get to the other side and they watch with their own eyes God allow the waters to close back in and Pharaoh and his armies be wiped away. They saw this. That literally just happened on their way to the promised land. And now they're on the way to the promised land. And they start complaining to Moses and to God that they led them out here into the wilderness to starve. And now they have this revisionist history about what was going on in Egypt, where they were slaves, what was going on in Egypt, where they hated life, what was going on in Egypt. And they start thinking of it fancifully because they tell themselves, well, we're going to be out here, and Moses led us out and he tricked us, and God brought us out here and he tricked us, and now we're going to starve. And this was God's answer to provide for them. What we just read. Every night you will eat meat. Every day you will have bread. This will sustain you. I will provide for you. This was God's answer to provide for them and ultimately to teach them to trust him as provider. The reality is, most people ask God for provision. Few people trust God as provider. If you're taking notes today, maybe on our website, or you're writing a few things down, would you please put this down so that way it begins to sink into your heart? Most people ask God for provision. That's where we started, right? Whether you're a person of faith or not, I bet you've asked God for something. You've asked God to heal. You've asked God to forgive. You've asked God to work out. You've asked God to get you out of this predicament. You've asked God to get them out of your life. You've asked God. Most people ask God for provision. Few people trust God as provider. See, the difference is asking God for provision really requires no trust at all. It is you lobbing something up into space, so to speak. You are lobbing thoughts and prayers and words into the heavenlies, and if something happens, cool, and if it doesn't happen, whatever. It doesn't require any measure of trust. But doing what he says, even when maybe it doesn't make any sense to you, in that moment, that's big trust. Trust begins where certainty ends. And what's happening for the people of Israel is while they had a terrible life in Egypt, they had certainty. They knew that Pharaoh was going to feed them. May not feed them well, but feed them. They knew that they had work to do, even though that work was getting harder by the day and getting more demanding and more difficult. And Pharaoh was making it harder just so he could make it harder. They had something they could count on. But now by faith, they're following God to the land God has promised to give them. And they have to trust him now, because it's uncertain. And God shows up right in the middle of their need, not just to be and bring provision, but to teach them how to trust him as provider. See, uncertainty really is the soil that trust is always planted into. You don't have to trust if everything's taken care of. You don't have to trust if everything adds up. You don't have to trust if everything makes sense. But if there's some space there in your life where it doesn't make sense, there maybe you have to plant the flag that is trust. There maybe you have to step with your foot and trust that God will work this out. Can I tell you, God's desire for the children of Israel is the same desire for you and me today. The thing that he was trying to develop in them is the same thing he wants to develop in us. See, provision ultimately is not about provision. Providing is ultimately not about providing. Ultimately, it's about being people who fully trust him as our source. And today I want to help you to be able to do just that. And so wherever you are on your journey of faith, could I encourage you today? Write this down in your notes. Begin trusting God as provider. If you are ever going to see God as provider in your life, it's going to start with you beginning to trust God as provider. You know, following God really sets in when you believe he is your source. Like when you truly and completely believe that he is your source, then this following God goes to a different level. When you start to recognize that you have breath in your lungs to do anything you might do today because he gave you breath. Your breath didn't just come from your biological function. It came from him. And he gave you your breath, and in a moment, he could take it away. And so you recognize that the reason I have energy today, the reason there is breath in my lungs is because he gave me breath. It changes how you see all you see and how you do all you do. You begin to trust him as provider. When you recognize that you have talent to be able to be employed, not because you're so smart and not because you work so hard, but because every good and perfect gift comes from him. It changes the way you see what you see. When you recognize that you have what you need and you don't have what you don't need because you see him as the source of all things, it changes the way you see all you see. And this is the way Israel began following God. I mean, they didn't just find themselves plopped in the wilderness with no training or preparation for this. This is literally how they started following God. Moses, their leader, was disconnected from them. He was a shepherd out in Midian when God appears to him through a burning bush. It makes it very, very clear what he wants to do through him. And so Moses, after a long conversation with God, takes his sidekick, Aaron, and they go and begin to communicate God's plan to the leaders of Israel, who are all slaves in Egypt, saying that God's going to deliver them. God's going to set them free. God's going to do this. He wants his people. And as they do this, people start believing. As the plagues start happening, and sometimes they are bad for the people in Egypt, but they don't affect the people in Israel. They start to believe and they say, look at God. God is on our side. God is for us. God sees us. God is taking care of us. Faith starts to build on the inside of them, and they begin to trust God as provider. They listen to what God says through Moses, how God is going to lead them to a promised land. They're going to have their own place to be able to worship him freely. This is going to happen. They prepare for the angel of death passing through the whole land of Egypt by trusting God enough to make the sacrifice he called them to sacrifice, and painting the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their house, so that when the angel of death came by, it would pass over their house, thus the name. They did all this by faith. They trusted God. They followed God out of captivity in Egypt through the dry ground of the Red Sea. They followed God in a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. When the cloud moved, they moved. If the cloud didn't move, they stayed put. This is how they started following God. But worshiping God in Egypt was very different than trusting God in the wilderness. See, in Egypt, they prayed. In Egypt, they sang. In Egypt, they worshiped. They did the things that they thought pleased God. They offered sacrifices. They did the things that they thought pleased God. But now they're out here in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16 and following God into some unknown territories. They are confused about their location. They don't know how this is going to go. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Though they were slaves in Egypt, they had security. But now they're out here just following God. It ain't just about showing up at a service anymore. It ain't just about offering the sacrifice and praying the prayer. Now the whole directing of their life is centered and oriented around God and the movement that God would have for them. It's different. It's different. It's a difference that you and I even find ourselves in the middle of. Can I tell you the greatest difference between a church goer and a Jesus follower is who you see as your provider. There are people, maybe this is even you, right now who attend church from time to time. They'll find themselves in a service maybe once a month, maybe every week, I don't know. They'll find themselves in a service online or in person, and they call themselves a Christian, and they know themselves a few Bible verses, but they do not see God as their provider. And you can see it in how they use their time. You can see it. You can watch them navigate their schedule, and you can see how something is talked about and becomes a priority and how things are moved around. And you recognize very, very clearly who they see as their provider. You see it in how they manage their money. You see it in the small decisions they make and the large decisions they make. You see it in how they talk about what it is they plan to do. You see it in how overwhelmed they are when political realities will come into happening when they are what they hoped for or aren't what they hoped for. Friend, today I need you to understand that God's not your provider because he provided for you. God is your provider because you trust him like that. God's not your provider because provision comes your way and it's, oh, how about that? God did that for me. God is your provider because you trust him like that. There are times in my life with the people I interact with, maybe it's even happened with me and you before, I don't know, where I will see decisions people are making. I will see the trajectory they are on. I will see the course of action that they're taking, and I know it's not good for them. Because sometimes it's a little easier to be 2 steps removed and you can see that somebody's heading in the wrong direction, even though they can't see it with the steps that they're making. And I will have opinions and I will have thoughts. And if asked, I would happily share them. But I've had people sometimes when I explain this type of thing be like, well, why don't you tell them that? Or why don't you make a scene and make sure they know? It's because, well, I've learned that just because somebody lets me preach to them doesn't mean that they trust me to be their pastor. Or just because somebody attends the church that I lead doesn't mean that they actually value the advice that I might be able to bring, or the wisdom that I could bring to that situation. It doesn't mean that they trust me like that. There are people who do. There are people who will reach out and say, hey, what do you think? Because I need to know how you see this. And they're going to take what I say with a lot of gravity and a lot of seriousness. And that is an incredible responsibility. But I recognize that not everybody sees me like that, trusts me like that. And so there are levels to this thing. Can I tell you, when it comes to following God, there are levels to it too. Because there are people who are willing to do what God says as long as it aligns with what they already thought. But as soon as what God would say or God would ask or God would require might challenge them, might stretch them, they've got every excuse in the world because they're very content being a church goer but not being a Jesus follower. They're very content with doing the things that fit into their plan and their norms and their ideas, but they will not take steps that require faith, particularly if they require them to step out of what's comfortable for them. Can I tell you today, friend, it's time to begin trusting God as your provider. For you, sitting there at your house, listening to this podcast, in your car, it is time to begin trusting God as your provider. You say, what on earth does that mean? I don't know specifically for you, but here's what I do know. Where do you not trust him as provider? Where in your life do you not trust him as provider? Start there. Maybe for somebody listening, the truth is you don't trust him anywhere. Start somewhere. Because trust will beget more trust. If you start trusting him in this area, you'll look up, and if you keep trusting him as provider here, you'll find that starts to bleed and spread. And now there are other areas of your life where you begin to start trusting him somewhere. Maybe you trust him with something right now, but you don't trust him with everything. Can I tell you a simple biblical perspective to put on any and everything? If you're wondering, I don't know if I really trust God. Here's how you know. Start giving God the first and the best of everything he's given you. That's how you trust him as provider. You give him the first and the best of everything that he's given you. Give him the first and the best of your time. How do you do that? Be in church. Come on, at church online, gathering with us in person, whatever that might look like for you. Give him the first and the best. The week starts on Sunday. Part of the reason we gather and worship on Sunday is because we are making a declaration by our presence that God gets the first and the best of my time. This is not my easy like Sunday morning. This is not my, I'm going to catch up on some things around the house. This is, I'm going to come and worship God. I'm going to give him the first and the best of my time this week. Give him the first and the best of your day. Like literally spend time with God in the morning. So, some of us, we give the first and the best of our day to our snooze button. You know what I'm saying? We give the first and the best of our day to Instagram or to TikTok, and we got to read a thing or find a thing. We give the first and the best of our day to the news. We give the first and the best of our day to something other than God. I heard a thing about 2 weeks ago that really, really challenged me by a leader in the Christian faith who I admire a lot. And he said part of his rhythm is to get up and spend time with God every morning. And he spends it in a variety of ways. He reads from a variety of things. He prays. He listens to certain types of music. He'll spend some time in silence. And he says it takes him about 2 hours He says, but it takes me 2 hours at the beginning of the day with God to be the man of God I want to be the rest of the day. That's somebody that trusts God as their provider, not their intellect, not how many meetings they can cram into those 2 hours. I give God my first and my best. Give him the first and the best of your week. Give him the first and the best of your day. Give him the first and the best of your life. That's what salvation is. I give my life to you. I recognize that my life is not my own. So I give myself to you. Some of you, that needs to be what happens on the inside of you. That you need to confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. Then you shall be saved. That you confess your sin. He's faithful and just to forgive you of your sin, to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Some of you need to give him the first and the best of your energy. You need to begin to find places, find ways to serve. To not just use all of your energy for yourself or for what you think is good, but to actually take it and be a blessing to God, be a blessing to people. In the name of God. Some of you need to give God the first and the best of your money. That's what the tithe is. We return to God our first and best, recognizing he is our source. It's time to begin trusting God as your provider. Whatever. Just begin to trust him like that. Because hear me, friend, you do not trust him as provider if you do not do what he said with the provision he brings. Wasn't that Israel's problem? Some of them were unwilling to do what God said with what God brought them. God brought them the provision. The reason the quail is there at night and the manna is there in the morning is because God did it. When are we going to realize that the reason there's breath in our lungs is because God did it? The reason we have any resources to do anything with is because God did it. The reason we have any talent that we might be able to use for something, to make money, to bless someone else, is because God did it. Let's give him the first and the best of it all. You see, trusting God as provider really is a journey. Because ultimately, foundationally, God wants us to trust him as provider. That's what he wants. And so God, this is what God does. God shows us he can provide for us by providing provision. That's great. And we see blessing and we see strength and we see resource come our way. But often we become more consumed with the provision than the provider. Start trusting God. Begin trusting God as your provider. And write this down. Stop trusting provision as provider. Stop trusting the provision that God brings as your provider. See, God provided for Israel, but when he asked them to trust him with their daily bread, some of them wouldn't. Which is crazy to think when you wrap your mind, as I've tried to share with you, about all God had done for them recently. I mean, they were just in Egypt as slaves. Come on, they were just working for Pharaoh with no hope. Most of them knew that they probably weren't going to live through the rest of this decade. And God sets them free. And God brings them out. And now all of a sudden, some of them are going to hold back and hoard what God has blessed them with. Because they don't trust him like that. They hoarded what God provided. And they tried to hold on to the provision God provided instead of holding on to him. Why did they do that? Why do we act like that? It's very, very simple. We trust it more. We trust it more. I know that messes up how spiritual you think you are. You trust it more. If you are holding on to provision God has brought you tighter than you are holding on to him, what is true is that you trust it more. We trust the needed free time on our calendar more than we trust what God might do in and through us if we took this free time that we have and used it to bless, used it to serve, used it to share, used it to give. We trust our need for our rest more than we do the God who gives us strength to strengthen us, even though we serve him with some of what we wanted to take and use for our rest. We trust the money in our bank more than we trust the God who said, I see you, I know you, and I will provide for you. I see the birds in the air and I take care of them. I see the flowers in the field and I take care of them. How much more will I take care of you? The truth is, we don't believe that, because some of us trust the money in our bank more than we trust the God who said, I'll provide for you. We trust the person in the political office that we can see more than we trust the one who sits on the throne of heaven and earth that we can't see. We trust provision as provider, and we must stop. Because when you hoard whatever it is that God blesses you with, please understand what you are doing. You turn the blessing into your God. When you hoard it, when you hold on tightly to it, what you are doing is you have turned the provision God brought you into your God. You've turned the blessing he brought into your life. Some of you, the God in your life isn't tangible. The God in your life is the gifting God put inside of you. But the problem is you won't use it for anything except your own good and gain. And God's like, I have so much more I want you to do through what I've entrusted you with. If you would quit holding onto it so tightly, but you trust the provision as your provider. You trust your talent. You trust your resources. You trust the strength of your back. You trust your time. You trust your connections. You trust it more. And maybe today, the reason you see it, but never see provision anymore, is because the last provision is rotting in your own house. Maybe the last provision God brought you, rather than use it like he said, rather than trust him for more, you hoarded it. You are hoarding it. And the reason there's no new provision is because you don't trust the provider, you trust the provision. And now there's a stink on your life. There's some rot in your own house. It stinks around you because what started as provision, you have turned into the object of your affection. It's time to do something scary, though. You need to let your provision know it is not your source. Stop trusting provision as provider. Can I tell you what I've learned? The freer I live with whatever God brings me, the more I see God get me what I need. Can I tell you what I absolutely do not have enough of right now? Time. I know some of you thought I was probably going to say something else. No, time. The truth is, most days of my life, I do not have enough moments in that day to get done everything that needs to get done. And when that does happen in a day, the truth is almost every week, I do not have enough time to do all the things I need to do personally, in my family, for our church, with the nonprofits that I'm involved in, with other things in the city. I do not have enough time. It always is funny to me when people wonder what I do, because let me just tell you the truth. Most people couldn't keep up with me. And I don't say that to brag. I say that to let you know, like, I get up early, I stay up late, and I work. And so it's frustrating to me when people try to steal my time. It is. I find myself getting very, very short with people who say they need me at something and they don't really need me there. Or they just need a moment of my time, and it's like, you said a moment, why are we still here an hour later? Or I ain't seen you, heard from you in 2 years, but now all of a sudden there's chaos in your life and you need me to stop everything for you. Sometimes I find myself getting a little short. But what the Spirit of God has been convicting me on for months, if not a couple years, that my life has been like this. He gave me the time. And I'll be disciplined. You ain't got to worry about that. But maybe I need to be a little freer. Maybe I need to be a little more engaged. Maybe I need to be a little more concerned about the person right in front of me, not the project sitting on my desk. And the more and more and more I do that, the more and more and more I find, not that like somehow I get more time than someone else, because I certainly don't, but God has a way of being able to expedite and multiply my time. He has a way of being able to bring people around me who can help carry the load for me. And so now what used to overwhelm me in one area doesn't overwhelm me in that area, because there are people now who carry that area and I trust them. And so I don't have to carry it on the same level that I used to. So now I can carry the thing that used to be not even able to get my attention. The freer I live with this resource that I feel like I don't have enough of, because it'd be very easy for me to insulate myself because of the nature of all that I have to do. But that's not what God's called me to do. I can't trust the provision that is these hours that I can count, these weeks that I can plan, these months that all have rhythm and flow and need and necessity from them. I can't trust the provision of that time as the thing that actually provides for me. God is the one who provides. Some of you today, maybe it's your time too. Maybe for you it's your talent. You're scared if you give away your talent in some capacity that maybe you won't be as valuable in others. Maybe it's your money. Some of you view money with such a scarcity mindset because you just don't believe that God can actually get you what you need. You don't believe that he can provide for you, so you hold onto it tightly, and you wonder why you're never blessed any area of your life. It's because it stinks in your house. Stop trusting provision as provider. You're scared you'll run out. God said he's more than enough. See, there's a mindset that you need in trusting God. The mindset you need is that God will provide what you need. Come on, that's easy to say in the church house. It's easy to say when you're in Egypt. But what about when you're in the wilderness? God will provide what you need. And God will bring you more when you can handle more. He will. God will bring you more when you can handle more. He will bring you more resource. He will bring you more opportunity. He will bring you more when you can handle more. I don't know if you know this, but God did not send Israel on the expressway to the promised land, because the journey from Egypt to the promised land, had they had taken the direct route, would have only taken several days. But they wandered for 40 years in the desert. Why? Because they couldn't handle the promised land. And so God had to prepare them. Maybe the reason you haven't gotten there yet is because God is preparing you. And maybe it's going to take far longer than you imagined. Nobody imagined that it was going to take 40 years to get from Egypt to the promised land. But that's what it took, because they had to get Egypt out of them. And some of you are trusting the provision so much, and you don't realize that the reason it's taken so long is there's some stuff God is getting out of you. And before he can trust you with more, he's got to get Egypt out of you. See, God will not be your provider if you're going to trust his provision more than him. And so, begin trusting God as provider. If you don't trust him as provider in an area or any area, start today. And stop trusting provision as provider. Stop looking at that calendar. Stop looking at that account. Stop looking at that talent. Stop looking at that resource. Stop looking at those things that God has provided and putting your trust in them. Stop trusting provision as your provider and keep trusting God as provider. Trusting God as provider is not just something you begin. It's not just something you initiate. It's not just something you start. It's not just something you do one time. You keep trusting God as provider. It was one thing for Israel to trust God to get them out. But trusting God when they're out, that was an entirely new thing. Sure, I'll trust God to get us out because we are slaves in Egypt. And I don't even know if I'm going to live that much longer the way they be working us. I mean, I've been seeing people die left and right. We be having so many babies, there's a lot of us. But it was easy to trust God to get them out when they were in the terrible place. The way Pharaoh's acting. It's easy to trust God while they're on the run. We got the Red Sea in front of us, mountains on both sides, Pharaoh and his army behind us. Oh, Lord! Easy to trust God when they're on the run. It's easy to trust God when you're in the middle of the Red Sea. God, you better hold these waters up. God, keep these waters up till we get to the other side. Come on. But now I'm on the other side of all that. Can I keep trusting God? See, for some of you, it was one thing to trust God when you didn't have anything. Now you have some things. Can you keep trusting God? You were trusting God to be your friend when you didn't have a friend in the world. Now you've got community. Can you keep trusting God? You know, somebody once said, I don't know if you've heard it, maybe if you've been here the last few weeks for services or listened to this podcast, but someone once said that success is the stumbling block struggle is supposed to be. It's one thing to trust God when you got just a little. But how about when you've seemingly got all the options in the world? Can you keep trusting God as provider when you're the one that actually provides for other people, or at least that's the way they think? Can you trust God as provider with the best days of your life? Come on, some of you are teenagers listening. You're in your 20s. These are the best days of your life. And culture would try to tell you, live for you. Baby, you're only young once. You need to go out. You need to be about your life. But there's something in you feeling pulled to God and the things of God. Something in you that rather than spend my time like everyone else, I'm going to spend my time making a difference in this world. God is calling me to some things. Keep trusting God as provider, even with the best days of your life. Don't be that person that wastes the best years of your life and comes crawling back to God. Listen, if that's you and you had to come crawling back to God, welcome. We're glad you're here. I just need to talk to somebody that is full of life and idea, and they're young and they're passionate. Keep trusting God as your provider, even in this season. Keep trusting God as provider when that raise really kicks in. It's one thing to trust God with your money when your money jingles when you give it. It's a whole other thing to trust God with your money when it feels like a lot. You know, we're wrapping up a money class right now. I invite you to come if you're watching this at church online this Tuesday night. It's going to be very helpful. But Courtney taught this last week, and she often tells a story when she is teaching this about John D. Rockefeller, who famously said, I used to tithe on my weekly pay, which was $1.50 a week. And that was what gave me the faith to be able to tithe on my first million. Or in his case, probably first billion too. See, it's easy to trust God with our money when we ain't got none. It's hard to trust God when you got a little something. 10% of your income hits different because you got some income. Keep trusting God as provider even when provision has already come. When you want to keep up with what other people are doing. Keep trusting God as provider. Or when the provision stops for a season, keep trusting God as provider. When the provision right now is barely enough and it sure enough don't look like it did last season, keep trusting God as provider. When the feelings you had about trusting God as provider changes, do you trust him? Or is your confidence in the God who provides or in the what God provides? See, the question you have to ask yourself is my confidence in the God who provides? Or is it in the what that God provides? Where is my confidence? Because can I tell you the truth about Israel? They would spend the majority of their time in this season, throughout their history and existence, not trusting God as provider. They were always duped by the provision. So much so that 1,300 plus years later, the Apostle Paul, as he begins writing the letter that he wrote to the church at Rome, his most significant theological work, records these words about those people in his introduction to this church at Rome. He's describing Israel and describing God's power to deliver them. And he says, yes, they knew God. Verse 21. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. And as a result, they did vile things, degrading each other's bodies. Listen to this line. Paul said they traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshiped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Amen. They worshiped the provision instead of the provider. Friend, the truth is, I bet many of us, the majority of us, this testimony that sounds so damning is true of us. We knew God. I sat in church. I heard the sermon. I downloaded the podcast and I listened to it on the way to work. That's you right now. I knew God, but I wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. I'll lift my hands. I'll sing a song, but I wouldn't worship him as God or give him thanks. And so you traded the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the things God created, worshiped and served the things God provided to you instead of the Creator himself. Can I tell you, when God does provide for you, because God has provided for you, keep trusting God as provider. Do not let this be your story. Don't let your story be that you knew God, but wouldn't worship him as provider, wouldn't trust him as your source. So today, hear me as I close. If you're not trusting God as provider, today is the day to begin trusting him like that. Do not put it off. I don't know what area of your life you don't trust God in and with. Today is the day to change that. It is not the day to pray about it. It is not the day to think about it. It is not the day to work on some things. Today is the day to change that. I don't know what area of your life it is, but if the Spirit of God has been convicting you, and even in this time, today is the day to change that and start trusting him like that. If you're trusting the provision as provider, today is the day to stop and to take a step of trust in that area. Some of you are trusting your age and you're trusting your talent, you're trusting your youth, you're trusting your resource. I don't know what it is you trust, but in that area, if you know you trust the provision, not the provider, today is the day to stop and to take a step of trust. And if you're seeing his provision in your life and you know it's his provision, double down. Keep trusting. Don't get dissuaded and disillusioned by what God is bringing into your life. Keep trusting God. Keep showing up and say, God, you are my source. God, you are the strength of my life. Keep giving him the first and the best of your day. Keep giving him the first and the best of your week. Keep giving him the first and the best of your energy. Keep giving him the first and the best of your life. Keep giving him the first and the best of your resources. Keep giving him the first and the best of all things he has blessed you with. And watch breakthrough happen in your life that you never thought was possible because you kept showing up. Father, I thank you today for your word. I pray that you would raise up within us the kind of trust that really will trust you, not what you provide for us. God, open our eyes to see where we are actually in love with what you have provided rather than the provider. Give us the faith and the determination to trust you with that, believing that you are our source and you matter more than whatever it is we're holding on to that you have provided. We love you. We trust you. And we're going to follow you fully wherever you lead. Pray all this, Jesus, in your name.